I want to start with some personal news. I will be leaving CNN in April. Let me back up. After most of my 20s working my way up in local news, I came to this network in 2008.
Every morning, millions of Americans turned on their televisions and saw the same faces. Familiar, trusted, permanent. And then, without warning, those faces were simply gone, replaced by someone new, the previous anchor's name slowly fading from memory like an old photograph left in the sun. Some of these departures were scandals. Some were quiet institutional betrayals. Some were the result of a single moment of poor judgment in an age where everything is documented and nothing disappears. But what happened after the cameras stopped rolling, after the contracts were terminated and the studio passes were deactivated, that story is almost always more complicated, more human, and more difficult than the firing itself. This is not just a story about careers ending. It is a story about identity, about what happens when the thing that defines you is suddenly taken away, and about the very different ways people survive, or fail to survive, that loss. Ann Curry spent 15 years constructing something most journalists spend their entire lives reaching for, a reputation built on genuine credibility. She joined NBC News in 1997, not as a soft lifestyle correspondent, but as a hard journalist willing to go to difficult, dangerous places. She covered humanitarian crises in Darfur, reported from war zones, and brought to international news stories a quality that is genuinely rare on morning television. She seemed to actually care about the people she was reporting on. Audiences sensed that. They responded to it. By 2011, the network elevated her to co-host of the Today Show alongside Matt Lauer, which at the time was one of the most prominent anchor chairs in all of American broadcasting. She held that chair for exactly 1 year. Her removal in June of 2012 was handled badly by almost every measure. The goodbye she delivered on air was visibly emotional, and watching it was uncomfortable in the way that witnessing someone's humiliation in a professional setting always is. What made the situation particularly difficult was the widely reported understanding, confirmed by multiple sources inside NBC who spoke to journalists at the time, that Ann's performance was not the issue. The issue was her relationship with her co-host. Lauer reportedly opposed the pairing, and in the NBC of that era, Lauer's preferences carried institutional weight. Ann Curry was not removed because she failed at her job. She was removed because someone more powerful than her wanted her gone. NBC kept her on as a correspondent, which the network framed as a continuation rather than a demotion. Anyone who followed the story understood what it actually was. The correspondent role came with none of the visibility, none of the daily audience, and none of the assignments that had defined her work. She stayed in that diminished capacity until 2015, when she left the network entirely. What followed were 2 meaningful documentary series, 2 seasons of We'll Meet Again on PBS, which reunited people separated by historical events, and 1 season of Chasing the Cure on TNT, but neither project restored anything close to the platform she had lost. As of 2026, she continues to report independently. The specific seat she held, and the trust that millions of viewers placed in her every morning, never came back. Her story stands apart from most on this list because she did nothing wrong. She was collateral damage in someone else's internal power move, and a 15-year career absorbed the full weight of that consequence. Brian Williams presents a fundamentally different kind of fall, and in some ways a more instructive one, because it illustrates precisely how fragile the entire architecture of a broadcasting career actually is. He took over the NBC nightly news anchor desk from Tom Brokaw in 2004, a transition that could have gone sideways in a dozen ways. Instead, he built the program into the most watched evening news broadcast in America, a position it held for years. His combination of visible authority, dry wit, and apparent reliability made him feel like exactly what viewers wanted from a nightly news anchor, someone who seemed to know what was happening and could explain it calmly. Then, in February of 2015, the story he had told multiple times about covering the 2003 invasion of Iraq unraveled completely. Williams had claimed, in various tellings over the years, that the helicopter he was traveling in came under enemy fire. Veterans who had actually been on that mission contradicted his account publicly, stating that Williams had been on a different aircraft, one that arrived at the scene after the helicopter that was actually hit. The discrepancy was reported, documented, and impossible to walk back. Williams acknowledged that his account had been wrong and apologized publicly. NBC suspended him without pay for 6 months and conducted a review. During that review, additional questions emerged about reporting he had done during Hurricane Katrina, specifically claims about witnessing violence and dangerous conditions that others present disputed. The picture that emerged from the review was of someone who had, over time, allowed his own stories to become more dramatic than the underlying events actually supported. He did not return to the nightly news anchor desk. NBC moved him to MSNBC, where he hosted a late-night program for the remaining years of his contract, which ran through 2021. The program never achieved anything close to the cultural footprint of his evening news work. When his contract ended, he left the network quietly. What happened next was not nothing. He became a genuine volunteer firefighter in New Jersey, which by all accounts was a real commitment rather than a publicity exercise. In November of 2024, he hosted an election night special for Prime Video. And in April of 2026, Netflix announced a podcast project with him. These are not the achievements of someone completely finished in public life. But they are also nowhere near what he had. The specific and irreplaceable thing he lost was trust, and in journalism, there is no equivalent of trust. It is the entire product. Matt Lauer's story exists in a different moral universe from Williams's or Curry's, and understanding why matters. He hosted the Today Show from 1997 to 2017, making him one of the longest-running morning television anchors in American broadcast history. For 2 full decades, he was in living rooms across the country every weekday morning. The familiarity he built with viewers over that span was almost architectural. He felt like a permanent fixture rather than a person. Then, in November of 2017, NBC fired him within 24 hours of receiving a formal complaint from a female colleague alleging inappropriate conduct. The firing itself was handled in a way that reflected both its severity and its speed. NBC's public statement went out early in the morning. His co-anchors addressed the news live on the same program he had anchored for 20 years. The awkwardness of that broadcast was visible to everyone watching. More complaints followed after the initial story broke, and the details that emerged over the weeks that followed were serious enough that Lauer's defense, that the relationships in question had been consensual, was widely regarded as inadequate given the specifics being described. He withdrew from public life almost entirely. He was not photographed publicly for nearly 2 years after the story broke. Reports described him living quietly in the Hamptons, having largely severed contact with the social and professional world he had inhabited for decades. By 2023, reporting suggested that his personal life had stabilized to some degree. His relationships with his children had improved, and he had been in a relationship with a girlfriend since 2019. He was reportedly spending time at a property in New Zealand. His professional life, however, has shown no signs of recovery. He has not returned to television. He has not launched any media project of any kind. The platform he held for 20 years is simply gone. Charlie Rose had built something genuinely distinctive in American television, a nightly PBS interview program that for more than 2 decades brought depth, patience, and real intellectual engagement to conversations with major figures in politics, business, literature, and culture. He also co-anchored CBS This Morning, which gave him a mainstream morning presence alongside his late-night public broadcasting work. By 2017, he was operating at a level of professional prestige that very few broadcast journalists ever reach. In November of that year, The Washington Post published an investigation documenting allegations from 8 women who described inappropriate behavior by Rose that ranged from unwanted touching to more serious conduct. Within days, CBS, PBS, and Bloomberg all terminated their relationships with him. As additional women came forward, the total eventually exceeded 30. The scale of what had allegedly occurred across decades and multiple workplaces became clear. Rose acknowledged in a statement that some of the accounts reflected real events, while disputing others and maintaining that what had occurred was consensual from his perspective. Reports from early 2018 describe him living at his home on Long Island, avoiding neighbors he had previously been friendly with, filling his days with fishing and tennis. The isolation was real. He later posted interviews on a personal website, including a conversation with Warren Buffett in 2022, but the reach of those projects is a fraction of what he commanded when he had the backing of major broadcast partners. No television network has approached him in any capacity. His case represents one of the most complete professional endings on this list, and unlike some of the others, the documented scale of the conduct described across multiple workplaces over many years makes it very difficult to construct any argument for a different outcome. Steve Kometko's story is in some ways the most quietly heartbreaking on this list, not because of the scale of what happened, but because of the disproportion between the original mistake and the consequences it generated. He spent nearly a decade as one of the most visible faces on E! News, bringing a genuine warmth and authentic enthusiasm to entertainment journalism that is harder to sustain over time than it looks. He was good at the job. Then, in 2002, during tense contract renegotiations with the network, he posted something on his personal website encouraging fans to write letters supporting his renewal. The network asked him directly whether he had used a company computer to make the post. He said no. He had. When the network verified this, they used the lie as grounds for termination. What followed was a decade of difficulty that Kmetko has spoken about with remarkable candor. He tried to find work in television and was repeatedly told he was too closely identified with E! to be hired by competitors. The identity he had spent nearly a decade constructing became the obstacle that prevented him from starting over. He eventually left Los Angeles and moved to Chicago to care for his aging parents, taking a job at an Apple store. He has described turning to alcohol to manage the gap between who he had been professionally and who he was in his daily life, and spending years drinking heavily before getting sober around 2016. He now hosts a podcast called Still Here Hollywood, where he speaks with honesty about his sobriety and the years that led to it. The audience he reaches is a small fraction of what he had at E! But the person he presents to that audience is considerably more complete than the persona he ever projected on camera. A lie about a computer cost him the career he had spent a decade building. That math does not balance, and it never will. Terry Moran had worked as a senior national correspondent for ABC News for decades before a single post on social media in June of 2025 ended everything. He posted a message on X late at night criticizing the president and a senior White House official in language that ABC considered a violation of their editorial standards. He was suspended immediately and fired 2 days later. He later acknowledged he had been drinking when he wrote the post, but he also made clear that he stood behind what he had said and would not apologize for the substance of it. That refusal to adopt the standard posture of contrition, the careful statement of regret, the expression of commitment to the institution, closed doors that a different approach might have left open. But it also said something genuine about who he was as a journalist. His defenders pointed to it as evidence that his reporting had always been driven by real conviction. He now runs a Substack newsletter focused on political commentary that had reached approximately 110,000 subscribers by May of 2026. That is a real audience. It is also a fraction of the millions of viewers he had reached as part of a major broadcast network. Brooke Baldwin spent 13 years at CNN building a reputation as one of the network's most capable and dependable daytime anchors. In February of 2021, she announced on air that she was leaving to pursue other things. The announcement was framed warmly, the way these things always are. 3 years later, in a 2024 essay for Vanity Fair, she disclosed that the departure had not been her choice. She had been fired. The situation had developed after she relocated from Atlanta to New York while her executive producer remained in Atlanta. She described his behavior changing in ways that made their working relationship untenable. She requested a different producer, which she noted was a standard request in the industry. The request was denied. She was taken off air for 2 months. In January of 2021, she was let go entirely. The decision to wait 3 years before telling the real story publicly reflects something important about how these departures actually work. The legal and professional complexities of her departure made speaking freely difficult for an extended period. But when the Vanity Fair essay arrived, it was specific and detailed in ways that a statement made in the immediate aftermath never could have been. The 3 years of silence gave her the distance to describe what happened accurately rather than reactively. She now hosts a podcast on Substack and describes herself as self-employed. The platform she built over 13 years has not been replaced. What connects all of these stories is not the specifics of what went wrong, but what comes after. The loss of a highly visible career is not simply a professional setback. It is an identity disruption of a particular kind, the removal of the thing that most people around you knew you for, the erasure of the public face that in many cases defined a person's entire adult life. Some of these anchors handled that loss with something approaching grace. Some retreated and never fully found their footing again. Some attempted rebuilds that, by any honest measure, fell short of what had come before. None of them simply moved on and forgot, because you cannot simply move on from something that was that central to who you were. The cameras stopped rolling, the studio lights went dark, and each of them was left to answer a question that fame had always answered for them. Who are you when no one is watching?